14 prospectors went to sleep under Arizona stars on August 14, 1987, dreaming of gold veins and easy money. They woke to find their truck tires slashed, radio antennas snapped, and water barrels drained into the dust. From the canyon rim where they'd pitched camp, the nearest town lay 43 miles through desert that could kill a man in 6 hours. Below them, in the mesquite shadows, rifle barrels caught the dawn light like scattered mirrors. The Diaz family had brought these men water just 12 hours earlier, smiling as they handed over plastic jugs and wished the prospectors luck with their new claim. What the Phoenix Mining Club didn't know was that those same hands had been measuring bullet trajectories since sunset, that the grandfather teaching his grandsons to sight down into the arroyo had learned marksmanship fighting federales in the Sonoran mountains 70 years before. By noon, vultures would circle the outpost. The property dispute newspapers called a tragedy of miscommunication was actually something far more calculated. The Sonoran Desert stretches east from Yuma like a monument to endurance, where summer heat turns car hoods into griddles and winter nights freeze water in metal cups. Saguaro cacti stand sentinel over arroyos carved by flash floods that come twice a decade, leaving behind channels deep enough to hide a horse and rider. In this landscape, where survival depends on reading weather signs and knowing every water source within 50 miles, the Diaz family had run cattle since 1923. Eduardo Diaz arrived from Hermosillo with 12 head of Corriente cattle, a pregnant wife, and the kind of quiet determination that builds empires from dust. His son Miguel expanded the herd to 300 head, learning to read the desert like scripture. Miguel's son Carlos inherited not just cattle, but the accumulated wisdom of 2 generations who'd made their living from land that killed the careless. By 1985, 3 generations of Diazes had weathered drought, rustlers, and the steady encroachment of Phoenix developers who saw empty desert as future subdivisions. The family ranch sprawled across 8,000 acres of deeded land and twice that in grazing leases, centered on a natural canyon that provided shelter and the only reliable water for 30 miles. Cottonwood trees marked the year-round spring that had drawn Hohokam settlements 1,000 years before Spanish explorers ever saw the Colorado River. The Diazes built their compound where ancient pottery shards still surfaced after heavy rains, understanding they were the latest in a long line of people who'd staked survival on this particular piece of earth. But by the mid-'80s, cattle prices were falling faster than summer temperatures, and drought had shrunk their herd to barely 200 head. Feed costs consumed whatever profit the remaining cattle might generate, and the Phoenix developers, who'd once seemed like distant threats, were now offering serious money for desert parcels closer to town. Carlos Diaz watched his neighbors sell out one by one, their family ranches becoming golf courses and strip malls, their names surviving only on street signs in subdivisions where none of their descendants could afford to live. Water rights and mineral rights. The Diaz family had always known their land held secrets beyond cattle and mesquite. Eduardo's grandfather had panned gold from the canyon stream during the 1870s, pulling enough flakes to buy supplies, but never enough to make him rich. Stories passed down through 3 generations spoke of Spanish treasure maps and lost mines, the kind of legends that kept men searching long after common sense suggested they stop. What kept those stories alive wasn't greed, but necessity. When cattle couldn't pay the bills, maybe the earth beneath their hooves could. In March of 1986, a University of Arizona geologist named Dr. Patricia Hendricks published a survey of mineral deposits in southwestern Arizona. Her report, buried in academic journals that most ranchers never read, identified significant gold-bearing ore potential in a geological formation that ran directly under Diaz grazing land. The survey mentioned electromagnetic anomalies, suggesting a substantial vein system, the kind of discovery that could transform worthless desert into the foundation of generational wealth. Carlos Diaz learned about the survey not from university publications, but from his banker, who mentioned it casually during a loan review meeting where Carlos was fighting to avoid foreclosure. Within a week, Carlos was in the Yuma County Courthouse, filing the paperwork to establish a mineral claim on the 1,200 acres surrounding the family's water source. The fees took most of his remaining cash, but mineral rights represented hope in a way that cattle no longer could. Phoenix in the 1980s buzzed with the kind of speculative energy that turned accountants into wildcatters and real estate agents into mining moguls. The desert that had once been considered worthless was suddenly valuable, not just for development, but for what lay beneath the surface. Office buildings sprouted from former cotton fields, and with them came investment groups with names like Desert Resources Development and Southwest Mineral Partners, companies that existed more as tax shelters than operating businesses until the right opportunity presented itself. The Saguaro Prospecting Club operated from a suite in a Scottsdale office complex, 23 members strong, most of whom had never held a pickaxe but understood leverage and mineral rights law. Their founder, Daniel Garrett, was a former stockbroker who'd reinvented himself as a mining consultant after the 1982 recession wiped out his brokerage firm. Garrett specialized in identifying undervalued mineral claims and assembling investor groups to exploit them, a business model that required more legal expertise than geological knowledge. When Dr. Hendrix's survey reached Garrett's attention, he immediately recognized its potential. The electromagnetic anomalies she'd identified suggested not just gold, but possibly copper and silver deposits worth millions if they proved commercially viable. More importantly, the survey indicated that whoever controlled the surface rights controlled access to what might be the richest undeveloped mineral site in southern Arizona. Garrett's research revealed that the Diaz family had filed a mineral claim on March 28, 1986, covering the exact area identified in Hendrix's survey. What Garrett discovered next changed everything. Due to a filing error in the county clerk's office, the Diaz claim had been processed but not properly recorded until April 1st. That 3-day gap represented opportunity for someone who understood how to exploit bureaucratic mistakes. On March 27th, one day before the Diaz family filed their claim, Garrett submitted paperwork establishing the Saguaro Prospecting Club's legal right to the same 1,200 acres. His filing included a detailed survey map, professional geological assessments, and the signatures of all 23 club members. What the paperwork didn't reveal was that Garrett's survey map had been traced from Dr. Hendrix's published report, that his geological assessments were copied from the same source, and that his March 27th filing date was the result of a $500 payment to County Clerk Thomas Morrison, who backdated the paperwork to establish precedence over any competing claims. 24 hours too late. The legal notice appeared in the Yuma County Record on April 15th, announcing that mineral rights to the Diaz Canyon had been awarded to the Saguaro Prospecting Club. Carlos Diaz found out about it not from official notification, but from his neighbor, who saw the notice and recognized the property description. By the time Carlos reached the courthouse, clerks were explaining apologetically that his family's claim had been filed just one day too late to establish priority rights. The appeals process that followed consumed 6 months and what remained of the Diaz family's savings. Lawyers in Tucson charged $300 an hour to file motions and request hearings, burning through money faster than cattle consumed winter feed. The legal arguments centered on filing dates and procedural technicalities, not on who had worked the land for 60 years or who needed the mineral rights to survive. Justice, Carlos discovered, was a commodity that cost more than most ranchers could afford. While lawyers argued over documents and precedents, the Saguaro Prospecting Club prepared to take possession of their new claim. Garrett organized the club's 23 members into work crews and assigned each member specific responsibilities for setting up operations. Most were weekend prospectors who saw the venture as an expensive camping trip, but a few understood that serious money was at stake. They purchased equipment, planned supply runs, and scheduled time away from their Phoenix jobs to work the claim. The irony wasn't lost on Carlos Diaz that outsiders with more money than knowledge were about to search for gold on land where his family had actually found it generations before. But the law, as Carlos learned, cared more about filing dates than family history. August arrived in southern Arizona like an open furnace door, with temperatures that peaked at 118 degrees and nighttime lows that barely dropped below 90. This was the season when experienced desert dwellers stayed indoors during daylight hours and planned any outdoor work for dawn or dusk. It was also when the Saguaro Prospecting Club decided to establish their base camp on the rim of Diaz Canyon, 43 miles from the nearest town and 12 miles from the nearest paved road. The prospectors arrived in a convoy of pickup trucks and recreational vehicles on August 10th, their equipment suggesting more optimism than experience. They brought metal detectors designed for beach treasure hunting, geological hammers that might crack rocks but couldn't move serious ore, and camping gear suited for weekend trips to Flagstaff rather than extended desert operations. What they didn't bring was enough water for 14 men working in August heat or any understanding of how quickly the desert could turn from uncomfortable to fatal. Daniel Garrett had chosen the Canyon Rim site based on Dr. Hendrix's geological survey, which indicated that ore-bearing rock formations were most accessible along the eastern cliff face. What the survey didn't mention was that the cliff face dropped 80 feet into an arroyo where flash floods had carved channels through solid rock, or that the rim itself offered no natural windbreak from the sandstorm force winds that roared through the canyon every afternoon. Setting up camp required most of the first day, with 14 men working in teams to level tent sites and establish a common area where they could plan their prospecting operations. The heat was brutal, forcing them to work in 20-minute shifts before retreating to whatever shade they could improvise from tarps and vehicle shadows. By afternoon, several members were showing early signs of heat exhaustion, and their water supplies were running lower than anyone had anticipated. That's when Carlos Diaz appeared on the canyon rim, driving a pickup truck loaded with 5-gallon water jugs and a cooler full of ice. He'd been watching the prospectors struggle since dawn from an observation post his grandfather had built during the 1920s to watch for cattle rustlers. Now, he approached with the easy manner of someone offering simple neighborly assistance, desert hospitality. "Thought you might need some water," Carlos told Garrett, his tone friendly but not particularly warm. "August is a hard month for newcomers to work outdoors." The prospectors were grateful enough to overlook any territorial implications in Carlos's offer. They paid him $60 for water that would have cost $12 in town, plus another $40 for ice that was worth its weight in silver under the circumstances. Carlos accepted their money without comment, but several club members noticed that he spent considerable time studying their camp layout, noting where they'd placed their vehicles and equipment. "You know this country pretty well," Garrett observed, making conversation while his men transferred water to their storage containers. "My family's run cattle here since the 20s, Carlos replied. "My grandfather learned the land from old-timers who prospected these canyons during the territorial days. He used to say the desert only kills people who don't respect what it can do." It was good advice, delivered in a tone that suggested genuine concern for their welfare. What the prospectors didn't recognize was that Carlos was also conducting reconnaissance, measuring distances and angles with the practiced eye of someone planning more than just water deliveries. When he drove away an hour later, he'd fixed in his memory the exact location of every tent, every vehicle, and every escape route from the canyon rim. That evening, the prospectors celebrated their successful first day with beer and stories of the fortunes they'd make once serious mining operations began. None of them noticed the rifle barrel that briefly caught moonlight from the arroyo below their camp, or the 3 figures who spent the night mapping firing positions among the mesquite and ironwood trees. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in Tucson occupies a building designed to project federal authority over the sprawling chaos of the Southwest, all glass and steel rising from desert landscaping that requires more water than most small towns use in a month. Inside, air conditioning maintains temperatures that would be comfortable in Minnesota, while lawyers argue over resources that exist only because of Arizona's brutal climate. It was here, on August 11, 1987, that 3 judges heard final arguments in Diaz versus Saguaro Prospecting Club. Carlos Diaz sat in the gallery behind his attorney, watching the legal process transform his family's 60-year relationship with the land into abstract questions of filing procedures and documentary evidence. The judges, all appointees from cooler climates, seemed more interested in precedent than in the practical reality of who had worked the land and who needed its resources to survive. His attorney, a Tucson lawyer named Sarah Martinez, who specialized in mineral rights disputes, presented their case with professional competence but obvious pessimism. The facts were straightforward and damning. The Saguaro Prospecting Club had filed their claim one day before the Diaz family, establishing clear legal precedents under Arizona mining law. That their filing had been backdated was impossible to prove without cooperation from County Clerk Thomas Morrison, who had already retired and moved to Florida with what neighbors described as suspiciously abundant savings. The survey map that had guided their claim was technically accurate, even if it had been copied from Dr. Hendrix's published research, rather than representing original geological work. Daniel Garrett testified that his club had acted in good faith, following all proper procedures for establishing a mineral claim. When questioned about the timing of their filing, he explained that they had been monitoring geological surveys for months and had moved quickly when Hendrix's report indicated promising mineral potential in the area. The fact that they had beaten the Diaz family by 24 hours was simply good business practice, not evidence of any improper conduct. Mr. Garrett, Judge Patricia Newman asked during cross-examination, were you aware that the Diaz family had been working this land for over 60 years when you filed your claim? Your Honor, surface rights and mineral rights are separate legal concepts. The Diaz family's historical use of the land for cattle ranching doesn't establish priority for mineral extraction. We followed proper legal procedures to secure rights that were available to any qualified applicant. The letter of the law. Martinez argued that the Saguaro Prospecting Club's claim was fraudulent, based on copied geological data and backdated filing. She presented evidence of Morrison's sudden wealth and early retirement, of Garrett's lack of geological expertise, of the suspicious timing that placed their filing just one day ahead of the Diaz family. But evidence of corruption wasn't proof of corruption, and suspicion wasn't sufficient to overturn a legally valid claim. The judges deliberated for 90 minutes before returning their decision. The Saguaro Prospecting Club's mineral rights claim was upheld as legally valid and properly filed. The Diaz family's challenge was denied, with costs assessed against the losing party. Carlos watched 60 years of family history disappear into legal precedent, justice measured not by equity, but by filing dates and procedural compliance. Outside the courthouse, Martinez explained that appeals to higher courts were possible, but expensive and unlikely to succeed. The Ninth Circuit decision would stand, unless new evidence of fraud emerged, evidence that would require investigative resources beyond what a failing ranch could afford. Carlos understood that he was looking at his family's final legal defeat, the moment when law and justice revealed themselves to be entirely different concepts. The drive back to Yuma took 4 hours through desert that seemed more barren and hostile than it had that morning. By the time Carlos reached the family compound, the Prospectors' campfires were visible on the canyon rim, 14 men celebrating their legal victory on land that had sheltered 4 generations of his family. That night, Carlos called a family meeting that would change everything. The Diaz family compound sat in the canyon's natural amphitheater, where adobe buildings built by 3 generations formed a rough semicircle around a central courtyard. Cottonwood trees planted by Eduardo Diaz in 1924 provided shade for the family meetings that had decided every major question for 60 years, from where to dig wells to which cattle to sell during drought years. Tonight, as August heat slowly bled from the desert, 4 generations gathered to discuss what law had failed to provide. Carlos Diaz, at 52, carried the weight of being the family's official decision-maker, but real authority still resided with his father Miguel, who at 78 remembered when the desert was less forgiving and justice was more direct. Miguel's father, 91-year-old Eduardo, dozed in his chair but occasionally stirred to offer observations that carried the authority of someone who had survived everything the Sonoran desert could offer. The law says they own our mineral rights, Carlos explained, his voice tight with controlled anger. The appeals court upheld their claim. We have no more legal options. Miguel leaned forward, his weathered hands gripping the arms of his chair. Legal options, he repeated, pronouncing the words like something distasteful. Your grandfather fought federales who came to take our cattle, back when there was no law except what a man could defend. We didn't file papers with courts in Mexico City. We made our own justice. The younger generation listened with the careful attention of students learning family history they'd heard before, but never in this context. Carlos's sons, 24-year-old Roberto and 22-year-old Antonio, had grown up assuming that law and justice were roughly equivalent, that disputes were settled by lawyers rather than rifles. Their grandfather was describing a world where survival depended on different rules. Eduardo stirred from his apparent nap. Pancho Villa came through this country in 1916, he said, his voice still strong despite his age. Told my father the revolution was about land, about taking back what belonged to the people who worked it. Villa was a bandit, but he understood something about ownership that lawyers never learn. What are you suggesting? Carlos asked, though he could see where the conversation was heading. The old ways. Miguel stood and walked to the gun cabinet that had held family weapons for 3 generations. Inside were hunting rifles, a shotgun, and an ancient Mauser that Eduardo had carried during the Revolution. I'm suggesting that 14 city men camping on our land with no water and no way out represents opportunity, not just insult. Roberto, who had inherited his great-grandfather's quick temper along with his sharp features, spoke up immediately. They stole our claim with crooked paperwork and bribed clerks. Why should we let them profit from what's ours? Antonio, more cautious but equally angry, asked the practical question. What happens after? You can't just make 14 men disappear without consequences. Miguel smiled grimly. Desert has been making people disappear for thousands of years. Prospectors get lost, run out of water, make mistakes. Happens all the time in country like this. The family spent 2 hours discussing what their lawyers would have called conspiracy to commit murder, but what they understood is reclaiming what belonged to them. They talked about timing, about methods, about what story they would tell when bodies were eventually discovered. The conversation was calm, methodical, informed by generations of experience reading weather patterns and tracking lost cattle through terrain that could kill the unprepared. Carlos found himself thinking about his children's futures, about the ranch they would inherit if the family survived, about the justice system that protected fraud while punishing honesty. By midnight, when the family meeting ended, they had moved from discussing whether to act to planning how their action would succeed. Dawn in the Sonoran desert comes fast and cool, with temperatures that briefly make outdoor work possible before the sun climbs high enough to turn air into furnace heat. At 5:30 a.m. on August 12th, 3 generations of Diaz men gathered in the arroyo below the Prospectors' camp for what Miguel called refresher training, and what Carlos understood as preparation for mass murder. The family's shooting positions had been established decades earlier, when cattle rustlers and border bandits made defensive planning a survival necessity. Eduardo had chosen sites that provided clear fields of fire while remaining invisible from the canyon rim, natural rock formations that offered concealment and multiple escape routes. Now, Miguel was teaching his grandson and great-grandsons how to use terrain the old man had mapped during the Revolution. Shooting up is harder than shooting down, Miguel explained, pointing to where the prospectors' tents dotted the rim 80 feet above. Gravity works against you, and range estimation gets tricky with that much elevation change, but they can't see us from up there, and they can't retreat anywhere except along the rim. Roberto had inherited the family gift for marksmanship, able to group 5 shots within a playing card at 200 yards. Antonio was competent, but not exceptional, the kind of shooter who could handle ranch work but shouldn't attempt anything demanding. Carlos fell between his sons in ability, good enough for hunting but not for precision work under pressure. Miguel directed their practice toward the specific challenges they would face, firing positions that accommodated the canyon's elevation changes, range cards that marked exact distances to key points along the rim, communication signals that would coordinate their action without radio equipment that could be monitored or traced. Lessons from the Revolution. Your great-grandfather learned this from Villa's men, Miguel explained as he demonstrated how to use rock formations for cover between shots. They called it emboscada, the art of turning terrain into a weapon. You don't fight where the enemy chooses. You make the ground work for you. The tactical situation was almost perfect from the defenders' perspective. The prospectors were trapped on a narrow canyon rim with limited cover and no escape routes except along predictable paths. Their vehicles provided some concealment, but also marked their positions and created obvious targets. Most importantly, they had no idea they were under observation by men who had been planning their deaths since the courthouse decision. Eduardo, despite his age, insisted on demonstrating the shooting techniques that had kept him alive during the revolution. His hands shook slightly, but his eyes were still sharp enough to call exact ranges and identify weak points in the enemy position. "You kill them all or you kill none of them," he said matter-of-factly. "Survivors tell stories, and stories bring trouble." The lesson continued for 2 hours, until rising temperatures made the arroyo floor uncomfortable and the prospectors above began stirring around their camp. Miguel was satisfied that his students understood their roles and could execute them effectively. Carlos was horrified to realize that he was satisfied too, that planning mass murder felt like solving a practical problem rather than crossing a moral line. As they climbed back toward the family compound, Carlos asked his father the question that had been troubling him since the previous night. "How do we live with this afterward?" Miguel paused on the steep trail, looking back toward the arroyo where they'd spent the morning planning multiple homicides. "Same way your grandfather lived with the men he killed during the revolution. You remember that they would have killed you first if they'd had the chance." August 13th passed in a haze of ordinary ranch work that masked extraordinary preparation. Carlos repaired fence line that didn't need repair, moving along the canyon rim to observe the prospectors' routines and identify their vulnerabilities. Miguel serviced vehicles and equipment, ensuring that family transportation would be reliable during the chaos that would follow the attack. Roberto and Antonio tended cattle with unusual care, establishing alibis for their presence in areas far from the canyon during the crucial hours. The prospectors themselves provided inadvertent assistance by maintaining predictable schedules that made targeting them easier. They rose at dawn, worked until the heat became unbearable around 10 a.m., retreated to shade during the brutal afternoon hours, and resumed activity in the early evening when temperatures dropped below 100 degrees. Their evening routine included a communal meal around a central campfire. 14 men gathered in an area that offered no protection from rifle fire originating in the arroyo below. Daniel Garrett's leadership style emphasized consensus and group participation, which created long planning sessions where the entire club discussed their prospecting strategy for the following day. These meetings provided perfect intelligence about their intentions and movements, conversations that carried clearly across the desert air to listeners positioned among the mesquite trees below the rim. Information and opportunity. Dr. Patricia Hendricks arrived that afternoon, driving down from the University of Arizona to observe the club's operations and provide geological guidance based on her original survey. Her presence complicated the tactical situation by adding a civilian who was not legally part of the dispute and whose death would attract unwanted attention. Miguel argued for including her among the targets, reasoning that witnesses were witnesses regardless of their affiliations. Carlos insisted that killing a university professor would bring federal investigators who might uncover evidence that local authorities would miss. The debate continued through dinner, with 3 generations weighing moral and practical considerations that would have seemed surreal to outsiders, but felt entirely reasonable to men who had already decided that mass murder was an acceptable solution to their legal problems. Eduardo settled the question with the authority of someone whose opinions had guided family decisions for 7 decades. "The woman goes home tomorrow," he declared. "She's not part of what stole our land. We're not bandits. We're fighting for what's ours." That decision established the timeline for their attack. Hendricks would depart Thursday morning, August 14th, leaving 14 prospectors alone on the canyon rim, with no witnesses and no one expecting communication until their planned supply run the following Sunday. The 3-day window would provide time for the assault, cleanup, and establishing their alibis before anyone realized the prospectors were missing. The family spent the evening conducting final equipment checks and reviewing their plans step by step. Each man knew his assigned position, his primary and secondary targets, his escape route if things went wrong. They synchronized their watches, confirmed their signals, and verified that their rifles were zeroed for the specific ranges they would encounter. Carlos lay awake that night listening to coyotes calling across the desert and wondering when he had become someone capable of planning multiple murders with the same methodical attention he gave to vaccinating cattle. The answer, he realized, was that he had always been capable of it. The desert had simply provided the circumstances where that capability became necessary. Dr. Patricia Hendricks departed at dawn on August 14th, her Jeep Cherokee kicking up dust clouds that marked her progress until she disappeared around the first bend in the access road. The prospectors watched her leave with obvious disappointment, their expressions suggesting they had hoped for more definitive guidance about where to focus their mining efforts. Now they faced another day of August heat with nothing but theoretical geological knowledge to guide their search for ore that might or might not exist beneath their feet. Daniel Garrett called a morning meeting to address the water situation that was becoming critical to their continued operations. Despite rationing and careful management, their supplies were running dangerously low after 4 days of desert camping. The nearest source was a trading post 43 miles away, which required someone to drive the difficult access road and lose most of a day to what should have been a simple resupply mission. "We need to make a decision," Garrett announced to the assembled club members. "Either someone drives to town for water today, or we pack up and try again in October when the weather's more reasonable." The debate that followed revealed significant disagreement about whether their initial prospecting efforts justified continued investment in what was proving to be expensive and uncomfortable camping. Several members advocated returning to Phoenix and organizing a proper expedition with professional equipment and adequate supplies. Others argued that they had spent too much money and effort to abandon the claim after less than a week. Miguel Diaz resolved their dilemma by appearing at their camp around 9 a.m., driving the same pickup truck loaded with 5-gallon water jugs that had rescued them on their first day. This time, however, his prices had doubled, and his manner carried less neighborly warmth and more businesslike efficiency. Desert economics. "Water situation getting serious?" Miguel asked, though the answer was obvious from the prospectors' eager expressions and the empty containers scattered around their camp. "We can pay whatever you're asking," Garrett assured him quickly. "How much for enough water to get us through the weekend?" Miguel calculated loudly enough for everyone to hear. 14 men, 3 days, desert heat. Figure 2 gallons per man per day minimum. That's 84 gallons. Call it 17 jugs at $20 each. $340 plus $50 for ice. It was highway robbery disguised as emergency pricing, but the prospectors had no alternatives except abandoning their claim or risking heat exhaustion during the drive to town. They paid without serious complaint, understanding that Miguel held all the leverage in negotiations where water meant survival. While the club members transferred water to their storage containers, Miguel conducted the same careful observation that had characterized Carlos's visit 2 days earlier. He noted changes in their camp layout, evaluated their equipment for anything that might represent a communications threat, and counted vehicles to confirm that all 14 men remained on site with no additional witnesses present. What the prospectors interpreted as casual curiosity was actually final reconnaissance before an assault that would begin in less than 12 hours. Miguel was measuring distances, identifying cover, and confirming that nothing had changed since the family had planned their attack routes. His friendly conversation about weather and geology masked professional evaluation of target vulnerability by someone who had learned those skills during a revolution that had claimed millions of lives. As Miguel prepared to leave, Garrett made an offhand comment that changed everything. "Hope we'll be good neighbors once we get operations running seriously. Maybe we can work out some kind of partnership arrangement." Miguel's expression didn't change, but his hands tightened slightly on the truck's steering wheel. Partnership. As if 60 years of family history counted for nothing against legal documents filed by strangers with more money than sense. As if ownership was something that could be shared with people who had stolen it through bribery and fraud. "Maybe," Miguel replied, his voice carefully neutral. "Depends on how things work out." He drove away knowing that 14 men would die that night, their celebration of legal victory turning into something the newspapers would struggle to explain without using words like massacre and execution. Midnight in the Sonoran desert brings blessed relief from temperatures that can kill, but August nights still hover near 90 degrees with humidity that makes clothing stick to skin and breathing feel like drinking hot air. The prospectors had settled into sleep around 11 p.m., their campfire reduced to embers that provided no illumination beyond the immediate circle of stones where they had cooked their final meal. From observation positions established during 3 generations of cattle ranching, the Diaz family had watched the prospectors' evening routine with the patience of hunters who understood that successful ambush required perfect timing. Now, as the desert settled into its brief period of relative coolness, 4 men moved through terrain they had known since childhood toward positions that would allow them to execute 14 people with minimal risk to themselves. Miguel took the primary position, a natural rock formation that provided concealment and clear fields of fire toward the prospectors' vehicles and equipment. His rifle, a Winchester Model 70 that had belonged to his father, was zeroed for the exact range from his position to the camp's perimeter. At 78, he retained the steady hands and sharp eyes that had made him the family's designated marksman for 50 years. Carlos positioned himself 60 yards to Miguel's left, where a fallen cottonwood provided cover and overlapping fire zones that would prevent escape along the Canyon Rim's eastern approaches. Roberto took the western position, armed with a scope-mounted rifle that could reach targets at extended range if any prospectors attempted to flee toward the access road. Antonio, the youngest and least experienced marksman, received the assignment that required more nerve than precision. He would approach the camp from the north, using darkness and carefully placed charges to disable the prospectors' vehicles before the shooting began. Without transportation, 14 men would be trapped on the canyon rim with nowhere to run except into the fields of fire that his father and grandfather had prepared. The killing ground. The plan they had rehearsed required coordination that depended on family bonds forged through 60 years of shared hardship and mutual dependence. Miguel would fire the first shot, targeting Daniel Garrett as the expedition leader whose death would create immediate confusion and panic. Carlos and Roberto would then engage targets of opportunity, focusing on anyone who appeared to be reaching for weapons or attempting to organize resistance. The assault was designed to be overwhelming and final, drawing on tactical principles that Eduardo had learned during the revolution and passed down through 3 generations of sons who understood that survival sometimes required becoming more ruthless than the enemies who threatened their way of life. 14 men would die not because they were evil, but because they had legal claim to mineral rights that represented the Diaz family's last chance to avoid bankruptcy and displacement. By 12:30 a.m., all 4 family members were in position with clear lines of sight toward the sleeping camp. Their radios, set to a hunting frequency that would not interfere with emergency services communications, crackled with brief position reports that confirmed everyone was ready to begin what Miguel called the work. The prospectors slept peacefully in their tents, exhausted by heat and optimistic about their legal victory and the geological potential that had brought them to this particular stretch of desert. None of them had posted guards or taken security precautions that might have detected the family of marksmen who were measuring distances and calculating bullet trajectories in the darkness surrounding their camp. What would you do, sleeping in a tent on disputed land, if you knew that 4 generations of anger were converging on your position with military precision and nothing to lose? The prospectors never had a chance to make that choice, because they never knew the choice existed until Antonio's explosives turned their vehicles into twisted metal and Miguel's first shot transformed their celebration into slaughter. At 2:15 a.m. on August 15th, Antonio Diaz moved through the prospectors' camp. Like a ghost educated in violence, placing small explosive charges on engine blocks and fuel lines with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned demolitions from YouTube videos and family stories about sabotaging Federale vehicles during the revolution. His work required 23 minutes to complete, moving from vehicle to vehicle, while 14 men slept within yards of equipment that would shortly become useless scrap metal. The charges themselves were simple devices, road flares modified with wire and timer mechanisms that Antonio had tested on abandoned cars in the desert behind the family compound. They would disable rather than destroy the vehicles, ensuring that the prospectors would be stranded, but that explosions would not create noise that might carry to distant ranches or attract attention from aircraft that occasionally crossed the area. Miguel Diaz watched his youngest grandson work with a mixture of pride and apprehension, remembering his own first taste of violence during the revolution, when he had been barely older than Antonio was now. The boy moved with natural stealth and mechanical aptitude that suggested he had inherited more than just the family's marksmanship abilities. Violence, Miguel understood, was sometimes a genetic gift that skipped generations before emerging when circumstances demanded its application. The radio check at 2:38 a.m. confirmed that all positions were ready and that Antonio had completed his sabotage mission without discovery. 14 prospectors continued sleeping in tents that provided no protection from rifle fire, their dreams undisturbed by the family of marksmen who had spent 3 hours moving into positions that would allow them to kill everyone in the camp within the space of a few minutes. Carlos Diaz felt his heart rate increase as 0 hour approached, but his breathing remained controlled and his hands steady on the rifle that would shortly take human lives for the first time since his grandfather had fought federales in the mountains of Sonora. He was surprised to discover that planning murder felt different from executing it, that the intellectual decision to kill seemed disconnected from the physical act of aiming at sleeping human beings and preparing to squeeze the trigger. The point of no return. At 2:45 a.m., Miguel's voice crackled through the radio with the single word that would transform a property dispute into mass murder. Commence! Antonio triggered his charges using a radio detonator that sent electrical signals to 7 modified road flares, turning the prospectors' vehicles into twisted metal sculptures that would never carry anyone to safety again. The explosions were sharp but brief, more like large firecrackers than Hollywood special effects, designed to disable rather than announce their location to potential witnesses miles away. The noise woke the prospectors immediately. 14 men struggling out of sleeping bags and tents to find. Their transportation destroyed and their equipment scattered by debris from vehicles they had parked for security rather than as targets for sabotage. Daniel Garrett emerged from his tent carrying a flashlight and a pistol, attempting to assess damage that would shortly become irrelevant when bigger problems demanded his attention. Miguel's first shot took Garrett's center mass, a .30-06 bullet that crossed 80 yards of desert air to punch through his chest and drop him beside the smoldering wreckage of his pickup truck. The sound of the rifle shot echoed off the canyon walls like thunder, followed immediately by Carlos's shot and Roberto's shot as the family began working through targets with mechanical precision. The prospectors' response was panic rather than resistance. 14 civilians with limited firearms experienced attempting to find cover in terrain that offered none against marksmen who had been planning this assault for days. Several men ran toward the canyon rim before realizing that escape meant an 80-foot drop onto rocks that would kill them as efficiently as bullets. Others attempted to return fire with hunting rifles and pistols, but their muzzle flashes only provided better targets for family members who were shooting from concealed positions using weapons zeroed for the exact ranges involved. The assault lasted 11 minutes from Miguel's first shot until Roberto's final shot silenced the last prospector who had been attempting to crawl toward cover behind a destroyed vehicle. When the shooting stopped, 14 men lay dead in positions that would puzzle investigators who tried to reconstruct what had happened during those 11 minutes of violence that ended the Saguaro Prospecting Club's mining venture permanently. Silence in the desert after gunfire carries weight that seems to press against the eardrums, especially when that silence represents the absence of human voices that had been calling for help just minutes before. At 2:56 a.m. on August 15th, the Diaz family began the careful work of transforming a crime scene into what would appear to be the aftermath of a property dispute that had escalated beyond anyone's control or ability to contain. Miguel moved through the prospectors' camp with the methodical attention of someone conducting a military sweep, ensuring that no wounded survivors remained to tell inconvenient truths about what had actually happened during the 11 minutes of precise rifle fire that had eliminated 14 men. His inspection revealed 3 prospectors who were still breathing despite serious wounds, a situation that required immediate resolution if the family's story was going to withstand investigation. The coup de grace shots were delivered with the same professional efficiency that had characterized the ambush itself, close-range work that ensured no witnesses would survive to contradict whatever narrative the family chose to present. Carlos found himself participating in executions that felt different from the long-range shooting that had begun the assault, more personal and more disturbing, despite the logical necessity of eliminating evidence that could destroy his family. Roberto and Antonio worked together to collect brass casings, ensuring that ballistic evidence would not reveal the number of shooters or their positions during the assault. The family had discussed this requirement extensively during their planning, understanding that investigators would attempt to reconstruct the firefight using physical evidence that could contradict their carefully prepared story. Staging the scene. The official narrative required careful attention to detail that would support the Diaz family's claim that they had acted in self-defense after being attacked by armed prospectors who had threatened their lives and property. Miguel directed his sons and grandsons in placing weapons near several bodies, creating evidence that the prospectors had initiated hostilities and that the family had responded with regrettable but necessary violence. Carlos planted a pistol near Daniel Garrett's body, ensuring that fingerprints and powder residue would suggest that the expedition leader had been armed and threatening when Miguel shot him. Additional weapons were distributed among other bodies, creating the impression of a gun battle rather than an execution conducted by marksmen shooting at defenseless targets from concealed positions. The destroyed vehicles required more complex staging, since the explosions had obviously preceded the gunfire, and could not plausibly be explained as defensive measures taken during a spontaneous confrontation. Miguel decided to claim that some prospectors had attempted to ram their vehicles through the ranch gate, forcing the family to disable the trucks before they could escape to bring reinforcements. The story was thin but potentially believable, especially when told by local ranchers to investigators who understood property disputes and sympathized with families defending their land against outsiders with more money than sense. What mattered was creating reasonable doubt about whether the Diaz family had committed murder or had simply defended themselves against criminal trespass and armed assault. By 4:30 a.m., the crime scene had been transformed into something that might pass cursory investigation, assuming that local authorities were inclined toward charitable interpretation of evidence and disinclined toward thorough forensic analysis. The family gathered their equipment and began the process of establishing alibis that would place them far from the canyon when the shooting occurred. But as they prepared to leave the site where 14 men had died for the crime of filing legal paperwork one day before their victims, Carlos realized that they had created a problem that might prove more dangerous than the original dispute over mineral rights. Mass murder in rural Arizona would attract attention from federal investigators who possessed resources and expertise that local sheriffs lacked. The cover-up might prove more difficult than the crime itself. Dawn came slowly to the canyon rim where 14 bodies lay scattered among destroyed equipment and vehicles that would never carry their owners home to Phoenix. The Diaz family had departed the scene 2 hours earlier, driving separate routes through desert-back roads that would provide alibis for their movements during the crucial hours when the Saguaro Prospecting Club learned that legal victory could be less permanent than death. Miguel drove the ranch's oldest pickup truck, a 1978 Ford that burned oil and left distinctive exhaust smoke, but could navigate terrain that would stop modern vehicles equipped with low-clearance suspensions and highway tires. His route took him 40 miles east before turning north toward Interstate 8, where gas stations and truck stops would provide witnesses who could testify about seeing him at a time when the prospectors were supposedly dying in the canyon. Carlos followed a path that led south toward the Mexican border, using family connections dating back to the Revolution to cross into Sonora and return through official checkpoints where customs agents would stamp his passport with times that proved he had been out of the country when the shooting occurred. The alibi was complex but solid, assuming that federal investigators would accept documentary evidence without questioning why an Arizona rancher had chosen to visit relatives in Mexico on the specific night when 14 prospectors died on his family's former mineral claim. Roberto and Antonio took the most direct route back to the family compound, where they would be visible to neighbors and ranch hands who could confirm their presence during morning chores that began before sunrise every day, regardless of what violence had occurred during the night. Their story was simple. They had been repairing fence line in the south pasture and had heard gunfire from the canyon, but had assumed it was hunters or vandals shooting at road signs, covering tracks. The family's plan required coordination that extended beyond the shooting itself to include weeks of careful behavior that would convince investigators they were grieving neighbors rather than mass murderers. They had rehearsed their emotional responses as thoroughly as their shooting positions, understanding that their reactions to news of the prospectors' deaths would be scrutinized for signs of guilt or foreknowledge. Miguel arrived at a truck stop near Gila Bend at 5:47 a.m., where security cameras would record him purchasing coffee and diesel fuel with a credit card that would provide investigators with precise timing for his movements. He made casual conversation with the clerk, a young woman who would later remember the elderly rancher who seemed tired but friendly, nothing like someone who had just participated in mass murder. The performance required considerable acting ability, since Miguel was operating on adrenaline and 3 hours of sleep while pretending to be conducting routine ranch business. But he had learned during the revolution that survival often depended on maintaining normal behavior while surrounded by enemies who would kill him if they suspected his true activities. Carlos reached the border crossing at Lukeville at 6:15 a.m., presenting documents to customs agents who processed his entry without unusual interest or delay. His overnight visit to relatives in Sonoita would be confirmed by family members who understood that certain questions were never asked about why American cousins occasionally appeared without advance notice and departed before dawn. By 7:30 a.m., all 4 family members had established alibis that would place them far from the canyon when investigators concluded that the Saguaro Prospecting Club had been attacked by unknown assailants during a property dispute that had escalated beyond peaceful resolution. Their story was consistent, their evidence was documentary, and their behavior would suggest shocked innocence when they learned that their legal opponents had died violently during the night. What they had not anticipated was that 14 bodies in the desert would attract federal investigators who possessed resources and expertise that local sheriffs lacked, and who would approach the crime scene with suspicion that extended to everyone who had been involved in the mineral rights dispute. Sunday morning brought the first sign that the Saguaro Prospecting Club's mining expedition had encountered problems that extended beyond equipment failures or weather-related delays. At 9:47 a.m., Daniel Garrett's wife called the Yuma County Sheriff's Office to report that her husband had missed his scheduled radio check-in and was not responding to attempts to establish communication with the expedition's base camp. Sheriff Tom Morrison, no relation to the county clerk who had taken early retirement with suspicious wealth, understood desert country well enough to know that communication failures often preceded more serious problems. He organized a search team that included deputies with 4-wheel drive vehicles, emergency medical technicians, and a volunteer pilot who could survey the expedition site from the air before ground teams attempted the difficult approach along access roads that challenged even experienced off-road drivers. The pilot reached the canyon rim at 11:23 a.m. and immediately radioed back information that transformed a potential rescue mission into a crime scene investigation. From 1,000 feet altitude, the destroyed vehicles and scattered bodies were clearly visible, arranged in patterns that suggested violence rather than accident or natural disaster. 14 men lay dead among equipment that had been systematically destroyed by explosives and gunfire. Morrison requested assistance from the Arizona Department of Public Safety and the FBI, understanding that mass murder in his jurisdiction would require investigative resources that his department lacked. By noon, helicopters were transporting crime scene technicians and federal agents to the Canyon Rim, where they began the careful process of documenting evidence that would eventually lead to arrests and prosecutions. Federal jurisdiction. Special Agent Diana Roberts of the FBI's Phoenix Field Office took command of the investigation within 2 hours of the initial discovery, bringing with her a team of specialists who approached the crime scene with scientific precision and institutional resources that local authorities could not match. Her preliminary assessment identified the incident as a coordinated assault conducted by multiple shooters using military-style tactics against civilians who had been trapped in an indefensible position. The destroyed vehicles provided immediate evidence that the attack had been planned rather than spontaneous, since the explosives used to disable transportation had been placed with expertise that suggested prior reconnaissance and knowledge of the prospectors' daily routines. Roberts concluded that someone familiar with the expedition's operations had conducted surveillance before executing an assault designed to prevent escape and eliminate witnesses. The pattern of bullet wounds revealed that the prospectors had been targeted by marksmen shooting from elevated positions that provided clear fields of fire while offering concealment from return fire. The precision of the shooting, combined with the absence of defensive wounds or evidence that any family members had been hit by return fire, suggested that the attackers had possessed significant tactical advantages that came from planning and local knowledge. Roberts's team began interviews with local residents who might have observed unusual activity during the period when the prospectors were killed. The Diaz family received priority attention not because they were suspected of involvement, but because their legal dispute with the Saguaro Prospecting Club provided an obvious motive for violence that might have escalated beyond courtroom battles. Miguel Diaz met the federal agents with the calm demeanor of someone whose conscience was clear and whose alibis were solid. He expressed shock and regret about the prospectors' deaths, emphasized that his family had accepted the court decision despite their disappointment, and provided detailed information about his movements during the night when the shooting had occurred. The truck stop receipt and security camera footage confirmed Miguel's presence in Gila Bend during the crucial hours, creating an alibi that would be difficult to challenge even if investigators suspected his involvement. Carlos's border crossing documentation provided similar protection, establishing his location 40 miles from the crime. Seen when the assault began. Roberts found herself investigating a mass murder where the most obvious suspects possessed credible alibis for the time when the crime occurred. The federal investigation that followed would consume 6 months and hundreds of thousands of dollars without producing evidence sufficient to support criminal charges against anyone. The FBI investigation into what newspapers called the Canyon Rim Massacre established a timeline of events that accurately described how 14 prospectors had died, but failed to identify who had killed them or why the assault had been conducted with military precision by marksmen who left no useful evidence behind. Agent Roberts's final report concluded that the Saguaro Prospecting Club had been murdered by unknown assailants during a property dispute, but lack of physical evidence and credible alibis for the primary suspects prevented prosecution. Miguel Diaz died peacefully in his sleep on December 3, 1987, 4 months after watching federal agents search his ranch for evidence they would never find. His death certificate listed heart failure as the cause, but family members understood that he had simply completed the work that had sustained him through 91 years of surviving everything that law and lawlessness could offer. The mineral claim that had motivated the original legal dispute reverted to the Diaz family when the Saguaro Prospecting Club dissolved following the deaths of 14 members and the withdrawal of surviving investors who decided that Arizona mining ventures carried unacceptable risks. Carlos filed new paperwork establishing his family's rights to mineral extraction, using legal procedures that no one challenged and that courts processed without delay or investigation. Commercial mining operations never developed the site that had cost 14 lives and generated national headlines about violence in the modern West. Geological surveys conducted after the family regained control revealed that Dr. Hendrix's electromagnetic anomalies had been caused by underground water flows rather than gold-bearing ore deposits. The mineral rights that had seemed worth killing for proved economically worthless. The price of revenge. Carlos Diaz sold the ranch in 1992 and moved his family to Nevada, where they purchased a smaller property and avoided media attention that occasionally renewed interest in unsolved mass murders from the previous decade. Roberto joined the Marine Corps and served 3 tours in Iraq, where his marksmanship skills and comfort with violence made him a valuable asset in urban warfare environments that resembled the Canyon ambush in their emphasis on coordination and precision. Antonio became a successful building contractor in Las Vegas, specializing in custom homes for clients who appreciated attention to detail and discretion about their business affairs. He never married and never spoke about the night when he had disabled 7 vehicles and watched his family execute 14 men for the crime of filing legal paperwork 24 hours before their victims. The Canyon Rim Massacre remained officially unsolved despite federal investigation that consumed more resources than any previous case in Arizona history. Theories about the perpetrators ranged from Mexican drug cartels to domestic terrorism, but none of the speculation focused on the obvious solution that a local family had conducted a precision assault to reclaim property they considered rightfully theirs. Sheriff Morrison retired in 1994 without solving the case that had defined his final years in law enforcement. His successor, a former federal agent named Patricia Williams, reopened the investigation in 2003, using DNA analysis and computer modeling that had not been available during the original inquiry. Her work confirmed the basic facts, but added no new suspects or evidence that could support prosecutions. Today, the canyon where 14 prospectors died remains part of a nature preserve administered by the Bureau of Land Management, its legal status protected by federal environmental regulations that prohibit mining or development of any kind. Hikers who follow established trails can visit the site where the Saguaro Prospecting Club made their final camp, though interpretive signs describe geological features rather than acknowledging the violence that once transformed legal disputes into mass murder. Local residents still remember the families who lost fathers and brothers to what one newspaper editorial called the last gasp of frontier justice in the modern West. The Diaz name appears occasionally in historical accounts of Arizona ranching, but most writers focus on the family's contributions to regional development rather than their connection to unsolved federal crimes. Roberto Diaz died in Fallujah in 2005, killed by an improvised explosive device while conducting urban patrol operations that required the same tactical skills his grandfather had taught him during marksmanship lessons in the Sonoran desert. His death earned a Silver Star for valor and closed the final chapter on a family that had chosen violence over legal defeat and had paid for that choice across 3 generations. Federal investigators periodically review the Canyon Rim Massacre file when new forensic technologies offer hope of solving cold cases, but evidence degraded by desert conditions and witness statements compromised by time make prosecution increasingly unlikely as the principals age and die. The case remains open but inactive, one of thousands of unsolved crimes that populate FBI databases without generating active investigation. The mineral rights that motivated the original dispute continue to belong to whatever government agency currently administers the nature preserve, their commercial value rendered permanently theoretical by environmental protections that prohibit extraction activities of any kind. The gold that Eduardo Diaz found in the canyon stream during the 1870s remains the only mineral wealth ever extracted from land that cost 14 lives and destroyed 2 families. Carlos Diaz died in Las Vegas in 2018, taking with him the last first-hand knowledge of how a property dispute had escalated into mass murder and why federal investigators had never identified the perpetrators of Arizona's most notorious unsolved crime. His obituary mentioned only his contributions to Nevada ranching and his survival by his nephew Antonio, who declined to be interviewed for this story. But sometimes, on still nights when wind carries sound clearly across desert distances, visitors to the canyon preserve report hearing echoes that might be gunshots or might be rocks settling in formations carved by geological forces that operate across timescales that make human violence seem momentary and insignificant. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.